Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on remote working by Dr. Balazs Vedres, who is a Senior Research Fellow here at the Oxford Internet Institute. We're very delighted that you all managed to join us here, and we will now commence the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Hello, everyone. Let me just start my screen share. Is that right? 1 second. So, welcome. I would like to talk about the predicament. We are switched to working remote. And there's very little we know about this yet. So this talk today will be partly sharing initial results, partly sharing my thought process, how to analyze this predicament, and partly a call for potential collaborators, co-authors to join in and start this venture together. So let me see. Yes, starting the slides. Yep. So what is the nature of this predicament? So the lonely coffee machine. The coffee machines, those wonderful ones at OII, are sitting there alone, unused, with the water cold, and we have a loss of face-to-face contact. The same is happening in organizations all around the world. It becomes a massive natural experiment. So what happens to work ties with many of us switch to remote work? For some of us, it works brilliantly. We see these orchestras that start playing together online and they just do it so well. But for most of us, it's often awkward. We try to replicate our previous processes or ways of connecting with the online environment. It's not always working out as we would expect. And most often, porting our previous work processes to this new world is something that doesn't really work out. What are the expectations? What do we expect happening in organizations when they switch to remote work? Well, the first is, maybe the most natural, is a loss of connectivity. And the loss of connectivity is simply a loss of ties. Ties are harder to maintain. So there will be just a loss of ties, a loss of connections all around organizations. Most specifically, there might be a loss of trust ties in organizations. Remote ties with its screen lag, a lack of eye contact, have been shown before to erode trust. And then the difficulty connecting and the difficulty of spontaneous and rich high bandwidth communication would also erode trust ties. There's a loss of unintentional communications. Unintentional communications are those where you don't know that you need to know something, and the other party doesn't know that you need to know something. It's just a conversation that we are so good at maintaining, maybe a casual chit chat, but you discover that you just learned something important that the other person did not know you needed to learn. Now, this is lost. Communication online is all intentional. You ask what you want to know, and others tell you what they think that you need to know. And there's no unintentional learning. There are studies about switching to remote work in research institutes where researchers have showed the loss of innovation and a loss of creative, complex sense making. And this is something we might also expect to happen. The complexity of ties, the complexity of tasks that you can accomplish would decrease. So this is a point when I will ask you to type in, maybe in the Q&A, a few of the challenges, maybe the hardest challenges that you have experienced in adjusting to remote work to get you started thinking with me. So how do we approach this problem? Organizations switch to remote work. what is the way to think about the mechanisms of making ties in organizations in general. We think of organizations as formal structures, and this probably is a figure that's familiar to most of you. There are divisions, there are line managers with their teams, and several layers of hierarchy. But we also know that work does not happen along these lines. Work happens along lines more like this. Actual collaboration networks with communication, maybe an element of personal trust, maybe an element of sympathy, all kinds of materials, Excel sheets, research data, emails, conversations on the corridor that goes into these lines that actually make organizational work happen. Now, what are the regularities? What are the laws that govern making these links? Well, there are a few that are returning in studies of organizational networks. These might be the first digit, the strongest mechanisms that guide our making links. The first one is hubs. We prefer to connect to hubs. So when we make these links that the previous figure was showing you about how actual work is happening, those links are made by thinking to connect to hubs. We prefer to connect to those well connected. We also prefer to link to those similar to us. This major study by Duncan Watts and co-authors at the university, about 20,000 people were involved. They have shown that, yes, we prefer to link to people who are similar to us, but the social network is also pre-filtering our friends of friends, those that might become our new friends, to be more similar to us than the average in general. And then third, we are making ties by closing triads, open triads. If you recall how Facebook is suggesting making friends, finding new friends, it's through the shared friends of your friends. These are two-step connections that you are making one-step connections. And by this, you are making a lot of close triangles in your social network. This is something that is good to maintain communities and trust, but it is not something good for keeping an innovative and open community. And then finally, the fourth mechanism that governs our network creation is actually a kind of a fog, a kind of a myopia, a short-sightedness making social network ties. We don't have a Google Maps in our heads making links. And this is important because we are making choices based on our perceptions, not the objective reality. This little case study here is a company of 21 people. And these people were asked how they think all the others are collaborating. And this is just one example showing you the CEO's vision. It's so off, so far off. There's just 21 people and they've been working together for years. And I could show you another person's vision. It's again very different and very far off from the objective, locally confirmed social network structure. What is really exciting about this is that these days there's a lot of study on animal social networks, and the regularities that I've shown you are there with various mammals all the way back to about 60 million years of evolution. So we are following some very deep-seated, evolved mechanisms of how we are making links, which is fine for survival of a group and individuals, but we often need to do tasks that are more complex than the task of a troop of monkeys. So we need to be conscious and reflexive about how we are making links. And this is where we get to the current predicament. And what is exciting here now is that I can show you two case studies, just fresh. I have received this data 2 days ago with two organizations that we work with through the company Bond Weaver. These two companies have been mapped for collaboration in the early part of 2020, and we were able to go back now and just finish the data collection last week to be able to compare before and after the crisis hits organizations. Two companies that I will be talking about. One is a company that we expect to be quite adept in remote work. The pseudonym is Professional Services. And another one that might not be so adept, Countryside Food Company, that have not had experience with remote work. It's kind of a traditional, conventional company. They are similarly sized. Data collection was through a survey of collaboration links, in total 21 network relations, and non-response was minimal, 3 persons in one company and just 1 in the other company. So let's see the network ties. How did the crisis impact connections? So the first one that we are looking at is frequent collaborations. At a first glance, it seems to be okay. There doesn't seem to be any impact whatsoever for the professional services company. In the Countryside Food, we see a bit of a loss of connections and maybe a bit of a centralization. So far, it's not a dramatic change. The first network picture on these slides shows the early 2020 collaboration structure, and the one in front of the reddish background is the current remote work situation just from last week. Work information flow is something where we see a change, especially in the Countryside Food Company. There's a loss of connectivity, an increased centralization, isolated nodes appear. Additional information is something that's related to the unintentional learning is also impacted in the second, the more traditional company. The organization works seems to be deeply impacted, and personal trust that we were concerned about losing seems to be impacted for the second, the more traditional organization, quite badly, in fact. Personal meetings, this is now interesting because we can compare this relation, which is more about a preference to meet in person rather than the actual meetings in person. And you can see how much there is a desire to meet. And if we go back to the personal trust, you can relate this desire to the actual connections. The question we asked here was, with whom can you share any personal issues? Personal trust ties. So in summary, I'd like to show you 2 charts. One is the change of densities, and then the next one will be the change of network complexity. So the change of densities, I think what we are seeing here, and I try to use my mouse to direct your attention. In general, professional services is faring quite well. This horizontal line at 1 indicates no change in density, no loss of connectivity in the networks. And these blue dots representing the professional services company are mostly above this line. So they are quite good. The other company, however, the more traditional one, seems to have suffered quite badly in losing connectivity. You can see especially the sense-making ties, thinking about and learning about how the organization works, have become much more dense, much more active in the professional company, and have become much less active, disconnected in the traditional company. Personal trust ties have been lost in both companies, especially related to the demand for socializing, which have not changed. So there is a preference to maintain personal ties, but there is an actual loss of personal trust ties for both companies. Complexity. Now, this is a way to measure algorithmic complexity of the actual graph structure, looking at the affiliation entries in the affiliation matrix as a string and measuring the conglomerate of algorithmic complexity of these strings, we see a picture similar to the density, the traditional company losing complexity so that the connections, the way they connect becomes much less complex, much more simple, more centralized, more sparse. And the professional company is actually becoming more complex in its network in the crisis. So what this suggests is that the impact on organizations is very contingent on the capabilities of organizations to navigate remote work. Those organizations not adept at working remotely suffer quite badly. The only exception is personal trust that seems to be impacted negatively for both. And at this point, I think if you could, again, use the Q&A tool to maybe indicate some practices that you have experienced working quite well, that would be really interesting. Okay. I would like to go on to a final section here on lessons learned. We have two kinds of lessons. I think on one side, we see new risks in this current situation. And on the other side, we see new opportunities. What are the new risks and the new opportunities? New risks are processes becoming less efficient, a general loss of orientation, and then team leaders, managers needing to adapt to new roles. There are opportunities as well. Organizations can start exploring new avenues of experimentation, new opportunities for reflection on processes and organizing principles, and the discovery of new personal potential in this manner. Let me show you a few examples of these. I mentioned the importance of opinion leaders and hubs, that we are usually making our links looking for the hubs. In a network terms, in the remote work predicament, we might see our key ties weakening. So actually weakening ties to hubs that have been there before might lead us to lose our avenues of organizational information learning. But at the same time, we will see new hubs emerging and new opportunities to become hubs in organizational networks. Let me just show you this example. A collaboration network of a larger organization with two hubs identified. And once there's a weakening of collaboration ties, there are many more hubs, actually different ones, and more. So the organization needs to be, if you're a leader or a manager of a large organization, you need to look out for a changing landscape of who the important opinion leaders might become. There's a different set. The shared understanding and knowledge, which is not very strong in terms of in networks in organizations, it fades even further. And there's a new opportunity now to form explorer teams, to allow teams to break away from organizational norms and expectations and start exploring new knowledge environments. Something that is not be so easy. It's not something that's limited by the usual workings of organizations thinking inside the box. This is an example, again, of an organizational network now showing shared thinking about organizational issues. Once that weakens, it might be a risk, but it might also be an opportunity to evolve different ways of thinking about organizational processes. Trust ties. We have seen that trust ties are weakening with the remote work predicament, but this is also an opportunity to build new trust ties, rebuild or build up new ones by one-on-one calls and conversations. trust ties can weaken. This is just an example, again, to show an organization at one point in time and at another point in time, there can be drastic changes in trust ties. And then the problem is those people left out and find themselves isolated or insulated in small components are highly likely to become disengaged or leave the organization. Relational awareness is something that, that can further weaken. And this can be a time for reflection when an organization can start to rethink how routines are working, how conversations are happening, how the fora that is organizing information flows is itself organized. So a risk and an opportunity again. And I think I would just stop here with noting that it's very much work in progress. And I would really welcome anyone interested in joining in. The data is coming in. We will have a larger organization's data with a few hundred employees come in a week or so. And other forms of data might be explored. And I think it's a dangerous, risky, unnerving time for many of us, but also an opportunity to learn something new and also to help those people, many millions of people, who have been forced to switch to remote work. So with this, I think I stop and I open the floor for questions. Okay. Let me see if I can do that. So please use the Q&A for questions. And let me just see if I can stop the share and start my video. Right. Okay. So any questions? Unable to start video. I guess we have to do without video. Maybe I just share the screen again and see if there's any slides that you would like to go back to. By the order for the question, let's see. You have mentioned the risks, and maybe okay, you can start my video now. All right, let's see if it works. Okay, there it goes. So many of you have mentioned concerns that the biggest challenge is new routines, as Chico Camargo says. Yes, we have to cook our meals, we have to manage cooking our meals, educating our kids, and getting into remote calls and webinars. Tahayasa, you mentioned finding a routine and syncing with colleagues' routines. Yes, so we have evolving routines, co-evolving as a big challenge. Victoria Hung mentions lack of boundaries. Everything is online and everything is home at the same time. Yes, these are absolutely great. Let me just try to zoom to questions. Again, Tahaya, so you mentioned, thanks Balazs, great work. You mentioned other type of data. You think results might change if transactional data are analyzed instead of self-reported survey. Yes, I think this is great. And I did, in fact, start to analyze email data. And I think email data might give us a very interesting insight into how our information flows are changing. Nevertheless, I think survey is also an important component because it is hard to get at people's own evaluations of trusted ties, people they can confide in, their demand for personal trust ties, and the actual amount of trust ties that they are finding. So I think we need to triangulate, as always, with both kinds of data. Chico Camargo, question, is there any relationship between the structure of the information flow network or between the information flow itself and the complexity of tasks the network can accomplish? Yeah, I think it's a great question to think about the content of the ties and the content of the task. And prior results of forced switch to remote work in creative organizations have shown a decrease in the creativity, the complexity of the task itself, not just the network structure. Andrew Cooper, interesting about impact and trust ties. How have organizations managed this? Yes, it's I think is an open question, and what we see is a load on employees and a loss of trust ties that is stressful, and the highly increased load on leaders, team leaders, as they try to keep up the one-on-ones and all of these connections. It's there's a fatigue, like a digital call fatigue kicking in with many of the team leaders. So you have to downsize the teams that you're managing. That's one lesson that we see. Anything above 7, 10 is becoming untenable for a leader. So you have to shrink the size of teams and maybe form sub-teams or sub-communities. An anonymous question, how can we encourage employees to build more trust during this time, and how this will impact the organizational productivity? This is a hard question. I think this can only be done, well, as everything else, remotely, and probably, for lack of a better form, more one-on-one communication and any digital means of joint activities that increase trust. The organizational impact will be severe, I think. Thus far, when we have seen organizations losing trust ties, it have resulted in disengagement and the loss of talent, employees leaving. Now, leaving is not easy, but disengagement will nevertheless likely happen. So if we increase the interaction virtually, do you think this will help to close the gap? Well, unfortunately, I don't think there's any other means at this point than virtual interaction. But we probably we should think about creative ways of interacting virtually, not just video calls. Adizah mentioning, will the OII be running a similar analysis within your own team network, as maybe the culture will be different depending on the industry? For sure, the culture is different depending on the industry. It is would be interesting to see how OII looks like, but it's also risky to engage in such a reflexive exercise. So that needs to be done with a lot of care, but reflexivity nevertheless is very important. Again, an anonymous question. If we partially develop organizational understanding by seeing how individuals self-organize in physical environments, how can that be replicated without physical presence? That is a good question. And that, I think, is the big question that we don't know the answer for. How will organizations self-organize without physical presence? That is something that we need to trace the evolution of. So far, I think, we have seen problems raised, and that's the loss of trust ties and the loss of organizational reflexivity ties and the sparsening of ties. But I don't know yet what's the new solution, the new model. We are working to figure that out. Yes, I will share the slides. And another question from Andrew Cooper. Could you explain a bit more about the impact on relational working? Really interesting slide. The impact on relational working. I guess everything is about the impact of relational working. Maybe you should clarify which slide you were thinking about. And then an anonymous question: what precautions should organizations take when switching back to physical workplace again? I think that's a really exciting question about how we could be careful in switching back to real. That is probably will be a challenge, especially the longer we stay in home office. We need to grow our muscles back in maintaining the richness of interaction and the high bandwidth that we are used to, and we're getting out of that a little bit with the remote work. Let me just see if I missed anything. Isabel, if you want to come in and remind me if there's any questions I missed or anything that you have seen that needs an answer. That would be great.
Very methodical, Balazs. Thank you. You went through all the questions nicely. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to everyone and for going through the questions. Just to everyone who is following, we will send the slides in a follow-up email after this. And thank you very much to everyone for attending. You can also reply with additional questions you might have.
Sure.
And we will pass them on. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you next week. We'll be running these webinars every week. Ideas, feedback, questions, everything is appreciated. So do send it to us. And thank you so much for your time, Balazs. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. And please get in touch if you're interested in joining in these efforts. I think there's a lot of interesting open avenues for research.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your time and have a great day.
Okay, goodbye. Have a great day.